Welcome to this week's Theology in Action. We're back again with Dr. Tony Caffey. How are you doing this week?
Hey, Levi. Glad to be with you.
Yeah. So are you ready to dive in this week?
I think so. What do we got on the
Great.
docket today?
So this week we're going to talk about young Earth versus old Earth, and the big point there is the Earth a few thousand years old? Is it a couple million years old? Is it somewhere in between? And I guess the first question would be, what is your stance on that?
Controversial topic, huh?
Here we go.
Yeah, I am a young Earth creationist. So I went to the Moody Bible Institute and I paid good money for that position. So that's my view. And that's what I grew up with. Now, there are different views, and even in evangelical Christianity broadly, there's those who hold to an old Earth view. There's those who ascribe to what's called the gap theory, that there are gaps between day one, day two, day three. My conviction comes from textual arguments, and this might surprise you. It doesn't really come from Genesis 1. It comes from Exodus 20, because as God is delivering, the Ten Commandments and telling Moses to honor the Sabbath day, there's that statement in Exodus 20 about God creating the universe in 6 days and then resting.
Yeah.
And that derived from that is this principle for the Israelites, and you might even say for us generally, to rest on the literal seventh day. And so hermeneutically, there's a principle of trying to understand it in the minds of the original audience. And so as Israelites are gathered in the wilderness, hearing this for the first time, as Moses comes from Mount Sinai, none of them would have conceived of, this could have been a gap theory idea, or this could have been, thousands of years. They're going to be taking that as, God created the world in 6 24-hour periods. And I think the onus is on those who would say, no, it's not that, or it can be broader than that, or it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And if you derive from that this kind of general principle where, no, it's not really 6 24-hour days, then how does that relate to the Sabbath understanding? If an Israelite came back to the Lord and said, well, I'm going to rest once a month because, we don't, it's not really a 24-hour day. We understand this more symbolically as, a time period. I don't think that would fly with the Lord. And so I think Exodus 20 is more definitive in terms of what's going on. Genesis 1, I'm sure as you read and research this, there's some issues there with regard to when the sun was created and how 24 hours could have been conceived without kind of the apparatus of the sun and the moon and all of that. So I get that, and I understand even the gap theory and recognizing that this word day, yom in Hebrew, isn't always a reference to 24-hour periods. Totally get that. And so the workarounds in Genesis 1, as people have constructed them, okay, that might fly, but then what do you do with Exodus 20? And so that's for that reason and others, I'm a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think I land on that as well. And for a long time, friend of mine, and we're recently talking about this topic as we were kind of thinking through this, he and I both used to have the stance of this is one of those areas where it doesn't matter, where really ultimately that's just one of those Christian topics that we're debating and arguing about and it's causing contention. So if it's causing contention, let's leave it off the table. There were some good points made that no, this is actually a stance that is very important, and you can't just not take a side. Would you agree with that?
It is important, and even those who would disagree with me say it's important.
Sure.
So I would differentiate between, I think we've walked through this before, the 3 different tiers of doctrinal distinctives. This is derived from an article that Albert Mohler wrote on theological triage, he called it. And on level 1, the first tier, there's, those things which make you a Christian or make you not a Christian.
Absolutely.
So you put the deity of Christ in tier 1, and you would, the Trinitarian theology, which the necessity of Christ for our salvation and Christ alone being the way in which we are saved. So those are you can't not believe in those things and still be a Christian.
I saw a term or a quote, I don't remember who said it, was reading today, and ultimately we should always come back to in this debate that it's about the rock of ages, not the age of rocks. And I thought that was kind of a catchy little way to say it.
Yeah, and that's probably leading to that second tier, which I'll
Yeah.
mention, which, there are issues that we can disagree on for
Yeah.
sure. Um, and even from church to church. So I pastor a church. You're in
Yeah.
my church, verse by verse fellowship. And there's certain doctrinal commitments that we need to have to be a part of this church. So we're Credo Baptist,
Yeah.
right? Um, so if somebody comes to our church and says, Pastor Tony, we want you to baptize our baby, it's time.
Yeah.
This is probably not the church
Sorry,
for
no.
you.
Yeah.
There's Presbyterian churches in town. There's Reformed churches that would do that. That's not what we do. We're Credo Baptists. And so I mentioned tier one. So tier two would be, what are those issues that we can be brothers and sisters in Christ and still disagree on? In tier three, we reach a place where we can actually have disagreements within the body of Christ. So, we're going to agree on baptism. We're all going to be Credo Baptists, or we're all going to be Paedo Baptists. We're going to agree on, the way in which the communion elements are taken and the significance behind that. But there's going to be disagreements as well. And we can still gather. We can still be a part of the body of Christ. Now, the tricky part is, where do we put this young earth creationism thing? Do we put it in tier one, or do we put it in tier three? Is it something that we can kind of, agree to disagree on, but we can't go to the same church at? Or does it need to be a tier three thing? I would say that you are welcome to come to verse by verse fellowship. You're welcome to disagree on my young
Sure.
earth view that we hold to, but you need to at least abide by that as being the method of our teaching, from children's ministry to, as I'm teaching Genesis 1 from the pulpit, or other elders. And as long as you can agree on that, then it's okay for us to be in fellowship together and to serve in the local church. So that would be the tier three distinction between tier two.
Yeah.
I do want to say this, and I think this will be helpful maybe for those who disagree about this. There's a helpful debate where Al Mohler and Brian Chappell argue through this matter at the Gospel Coalition website. And so Brian Chappell would be more the old earth creationist. Al Mohler would be the young earth creationist. And there's definitely some disagreement there on how that fleshes out. But here's what they do agree on. They agree that Adam was created uniquely as a human being, and there wasn't an evolutionary process that led up to Adam. And the reason that's important is because, and they walk through this, you do have this Romans 5 statement about the new Adam. So if Adam as a person is just kind of generically being describing, or that creation of Adam and Eve, it's just generically describing humanity at large. And God, instead of just putting one man and one woman on earth, he created lots of people and just put them on earth, like he did the birds.
Yeah.
Well, then how do you reconcile that to this new Adam typology in the New Testament? So, you have to have the one Adam with the fall, and then that passing down original sin to get corrected by the true and better Adam, Jesus, in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So that was helpful, because you have these two men who disagree on the nature of creationism, but they agree on that as being foundational to our Christian faith. And so I've been on elder boards with people who have disagreed with me on this issue, and we were able to serve alongside of each other. But we had to agree on that as something that was foundational to our faith. I do want to say this too, just a clarifying point about the young earth view. So there are some data points that have led people to about a 6,000 year time range.
Mm-hmm.
And people have worked through the math, going to the genealogies. So as I say, young earth creationism, I want to give a little bit of latitude on that. So I'm going to say between 6 and 10,000 or 6 and 12,000 years is what I believe.
Okay.
And the main reason for that is because the way in which genealogies actually work in the Old Testament. So if you look at the genealogies of the Old Testament and then link that up with Matthew chapter 1, there are gaps. So, and as an Old Testament person would write about the father of so-and-so, or so-and-so begot another person, that can and sometimes sometimes indicate a grandfather to a grandson versus just father to son relationships.
Interesting.
There's some debate about this, but that's my view, is that there could be condensed genealogies in the Old Testament where, just like in Matthew chapter 1, we're not listing every single person in the genealogical link, but could be skipping a generation. So that's why I have that kind of 6 to 10,000 range to account for maybe a little bit of latitude there, but definitely not, in my opinion, millions and
Yeah.
millions of years
Yeah.
or billions and billions of years. I do believe that the Lord created our earth and our world with the appearance of age.
Yeah.
So
One of the more recent points I heard on that really stood out, that is, at this point, I haven't really been able to refute it in my mind and play devil's advocate with it much. And you started, I think, kind of started talking about it and touching on it, was the fact that the introduction of the fall and the curse, and with the curse brought death.
Yep.
And if there's evolution, millions of years, something would have died in that process and in that point. If something died in that point, then it takes away from that point of death being introduced because of a curse of the fall. And that to me really stood out of, okay, that's absolutely, that signifies young earth to me. So
can I comment on that
yes,
too?
absolutely, go for it.
So I have a problem, just generally speaking, as well, with kind of buying into an evolutionary framework in general, because it's bigger than just kind of science. It bleeds into
Yeah.
philosophy, it bleeds into theology. So if Darwinism as a philosophy more than just a science, because it really does have a philosophical framework. If you buy into that, you do have this paradigm where the strong eat the weak, and where the mentality is that those who are weaker, those who are lesser developed, those who are uh, lack the strength to continue should be weeded out. That mindset really gave birth to the eugenics movement in this country and in other countries, and that starts to violate what we talked about last time in terms of the image of
Yeah,
God. So now,
absolutely.
instead of all of God's human creatures being created equal and having equal dignity, now you say, well, the ones who are stronger or
Survival of
greater,
the fittest. Yeah.
survival of the fittest, they're the ones that should have the greater value. They're the ones that should be given privilege. They're the ones that should be kind of advocated for. And it's really hard as an evolutionist, a pure evolutionist or a pure Darwinian evolutionist, to clarify that term, to get to a place of ethics,
Yeah.
like general ethics.
Yeah.
Like, why do we value those who are poor, or why do we value those who are, mentally handicapped? You can't get there.
Yeah, they contradict.
It's too contradictory, and so they have to kind of, and this is where a lot of evolutionary thinkers frame it. They're like, well, we have evolved to a place where now we are moral beings, and we do have this ethical framework because we're more highly developed than our forebears. That just
There's a
doesn't
lot of
work
pride
for
in
me.
that.
There is, yeah.
Yeah.
And also, if you're really evolving, why wouldn't you evolve to a place where ethics isn't always great for the advancement of your civilization?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if you want to be purely focused pragmatically on the developing your civilization, why not weed out
Yeah.
the weak? Why not weed out those who are less strong? Why not go for eugenics?
Yeah.
And my Christian framework says, no, you can't do that, because
Absolutely.
we are created in the image of God, all of us, and we're created, part of that is that we do have this value for our fellow human beings as those who are image bearers.
Absolutely.
So we're getting into a little bit of theology, a little bit of philosophy there, but these issues are bound up together.
Absolutely. I agree completely. A lot of it seems that most conversations I end up with on people on the other spectrum of this talk evolution of it's science versus the Bible, and I've never really seen it that way. I've seen it as there's a certain level of understanding where once you get to if you're in a shallower depth, you've just dove into the Bible per se, into some scientific understanding of something, you might be in this hazy place where it seems like it contradicts the Bible, but then as you start digging, more information comes out, and I've personally never seen a lot of contradiction to the Bible or anything. Ultimately, I'm getting on a little bit of my own soapbox here. Ultimately, God isn't bound by science. He created it. If he made things supernaturally, he spoke them into being. Scientifically, we can't prove that, in my understanding of any of that. So I don't necessarily see it as a contradictory thing. I know they use science to base it off of, but I don't see that as a good stance.
Yeah, well, the origin of species isn't purely science.
Sure.
There's philosophy
Yeah,
wrapped up in that.
absolutely.
And you have to make certain jumps
Yeah.
philosophically from what can be verifiable with science. And there is science, and love science.
Yeah.
Actually, some of the greatest scientists in the history of the world have been
Yeah.
Christians. Just look it up. Um, but there's also, in a modern day world, what you might call scientism,
Mm-hmm.
the idea that science is the end all be all, and we can kind of uh, make these philosophical jumps to create a modern worldview and even a religious system, and that's dangerous.
Yeah.
People who have gravitated towards that have really built a religion unto itself
Yeah.
that goes well beyond the way in which science and the initial propositions involving science and the um, how you build a hypothesis and the scientific method, they go well beyond that kind of framework. So so I don't think Christians have to feel like they're being anti-science, or
Yeah.
they have to
Absolutely.
broad brush science as a um, as a discipline, which it
Yeah.
really is. It's a discipline. But then again, there are religious systems that, and our religious system coming from the Bible gives us information, what I would call revelation from the Lord, that is not verifiable
Mm-hmm.
in a scientific sense.
Yeah.
If it is, that the best science would suggest, I think, what we would call intelligent design, that there is
Yeah.
built into humanity, into organic matter, into our humanness, an intentionality. And it's funny, as you look at that, the intelligent design, which does have a scientific framework, there are many within the scientific community that would want to basically cancel that
Mm-hmm.
or blackball that. Why?
Yeah.
It's because that as it infringes upon their philosophical
Yeah.
underpinnings, it's perceived as a threat.
Yep.
So, and Christians have been guilty of that in the past, where they've seen kind of science gravitate away from maybe the way they thought the science
Yeah.
should confirm certain things. This Earth as the center of the universe,
Yeah.
so to speak, um, as or the what is it, heliocentrism, the sun as the
Yes.
center of the
Yeah.
universe. That the Christians have been guilty at times of kind of suppressing scientific knowledge because of their faulty view of the
Yeah.
way in which the Bible spoke of things. So we need to admit that in terms
Yeah.
of our Christian heritage, but I don't see that in the modern day world. I see it actually the other direction,
Okay.
where now Christian views or a Christian worldview, or even Christian thinkers who are in the realm of science, are being suppressed, and
Yeah.
their data and their research is being
Yeah.
blackballed.
Yeah.
So
Somewhat on topic, but even just I think about, even as a Christian studying the Bible and how it applies. It's the same concept with that, is you can't read it and discredit what you read because you don't like it and just toss it out. You have to allow it to challenge your thought process and ultimately work within you and change you if that's what it's God's using it to do. Obviously, not everyone's going to want to do that. Threaten if it's threatening their thought process. We, as you said, we see often that people just want to toss it to the side and not think about it or talk about it. But that's not. I just don't think that's a healthy place to be. Hopefully, they can grow out of that. Uh, so another point that a lot of people bring up is we know the Bible has many different uses of languages. You've got metaphors, similes, poetry, things like
yep.
that. They bring up the point that really it seems like Genesis is written like poetry. So how can we take it as truth? How would you defend that? What's your thought process there?
Yes, that's a common objection. And let me start by saying this: poetry has a spectrum. There are even in English, we would have history telling that's more poetic or more artful than not. But that's different from what we would call the genre of poetry. So in English, as we're reciting poetry, we would have rhyme and meter
Yeah.
and those kinds of things. And okay, that's poetry. The Hebrews had that too, and the switch would be from a narratival form of relaying information to their poetic genre, which we see in the Psalms,
Yeah.
which we see parallelism is kind of the characteristic form of Hebrew poetry. So instead of rhyme, you would have, a parallel line matching, line for line. Um, and then there's in the kind of verbal usage there some variation on the conjugation of verbs. You would also have something that's called terseness, where you would use an economy of words to shrink the statements that are made. So
Okay.
that's quite characteristic in the Psalms. That's not Genesis.
Yeah.
Just for the
Okay.
record. And Genesis uses, I'm gonna get really technical here.
Go for it.
So in Hebrew, it's called vayiktal. And it's this verb form that's used to convey history. So when you look at Genesis, the same vayiktal form of conjugation and storytelling narrative is used there, that's used later in Genesis, as Moses is talking about Abraham, that's used later in First Samuel, as the author's talking about David. This is how the Israelites conveyed history,
Yeah.
with vayiktal. This is how they told
Okay.
stories. This is how they did narrative. And so Genesis 1 is poetic, it's artful, but to say that it's not history telling is not true.
Yeah.
The Moses was trying to convey the history of the world and the history of his people to his listeners, to
Yeah.
those people that he led out of the wilderness. And so the grammar of Hebrew actually argues the other direction, that this is not the poetic genre. This is the storytelling, narrative, history. The technical term is historiography. This is historiography. Moses is trying to tell his people how the world came into being. So poetic, sure.
Yeah.
Artful, absolutely. Poetry, but not history,
Yeah.
no, that's not true.
Another point I think I would kind of make, and you can add to or push against this, feel free to, is you brought up Psalms. Psalms are a great example. Poetry, but that doesn't mean they're not truth. There's Psalms about God's love, about multiple, Psalm 22 you've referenced tonight. Love Psalm 22 and the reference in the tie to Jesus. Like, the truth is still there. Just because it's in poetry form does not mean it's not truth.
Yeah, that's a little bit technical, because there are poems, I think Psalm 105, Psalm 106, that are historical. So
Okay,
now you
yeah.
have a blending of
Yeah.
genres, where you have a poetic genre that's used to convey some aspect of history. Yeah, that's true. I think probably the distinction systematic theologians would make is that poetry is less didactic than
Okay.
a narrative, or in the New Testament world, the epistolary
Mhm.
sections of Scripture. So there are times when David, as part of his poetic impulse, exaggerates or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
hyperbolizes,
Okay.
or uses, there in the New Testament world, you have Jesus who tells parables, and that's a genre unto itself as well. The parable is an actual non-historical means of storytelling. So, the rich man, trying to think of a good parable, like the Good Samaritan.
Mhm.
Did that actually happen? Well, I mean, that's irrelevant. That's not why Jesus told
Right.
that story. He's telling us a story in that way to convey meaning that's apart from history.
Yeah.
That's not what Moses is doing
Right.
in
Right.
the Pentateuch. That's not what
Okay.
he's doing in Genesis 1. He's teaching, it's didactic, but it's also history, the conveying of, to the Israelites, and for us too, human history at the very beginning.
Yeah. Great point. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of Genesis being a little bit of a different style of poetry before. So I actually want to go dig into that a little myself and see what I can learn about that style. I didn't know that. So digging into the application
Yep.
process, because I know you love that, and I actually, as I was preparing for this, I was thinking, like, what is the application in this? And I feel free to add I on or whatever. But my initial thought is this may not be something that there's specific application with how we perceive the earth, but I think we touched on a step back is how we communicate with our fellow brother in Christ or anyone about these subjects, and can we agree or disagree in grace and move forward?
Yes, we can. So there's, laws of polemics
Yeah.
for us as Christians where we can respect, as someone who's made in God's image, somebody who says something that we strongly disagree with. So I'll relate it to parents. So my son's 15, so we've been working with him for 15 years on how to take in information from the world and discern,
Hmm.
truth from science, from kind of the philosophical framework that goes behind that sometimes. So just as an example, I listened to a Christian speaker the other day, a Catholic, who just kind of, he had a lot of good things to say, quoted some portions of the New Testament, Jesus speaking, that was very edifying, love your enemies. But then he just kind of, not even aware of what he was doing, he said, our brains have evolved over millions of years to develop this
Yeah.
kind of ethos. What? So just being able to pick out from that, like, okay, there's good that this person is conveying, but there's, in his case, an evolutionary framework
Hmm.
that I don't agree with.
Yeah.
And actually, if I buy into that evolutionary framework, I'm not going to end up where he's at in
Right.
terms of, love your enemies, because that shows us that we have a highly developed brain that can do it, whereas our forebears couldn't. I just
Yeah.
can't get into that. And there's some really popular speakers in our day. I could name some names who use that framework and try to squeeze it into the Christian worldview. And I just resist that. And when Alistair was a kid, my son,
Hmm.
we would watch sometimes, nature videos,
Hmm.
which I love, National
Yeah.
Geographics and videos, and it's just inevitably part of that genre where it's like
Yeah.
hundreds of billions of years ago this happened, and so we would typically as parents like pause it and say, son, just so you know, this is what we believe and this is the framework that's built into that, and so take this with a grain of salt, and then hit play. And then there's great truth, even as you watch National Geographic specials, there's great truth to be extracted from that.
Yeah.
uh, but it's, what's the old adage, eat the fish and
Yeah. That was.
spit out the bones, right?
Yeah.
You got to teach your kids to
Absolutely.
do that.
Yeah. And it's a challenge. It's a how do you know what's boned and what's not? And I think the foundation and framework of pausing and having those conversations with family or whoever it may be is absolutely how that process is gone about.
There have been times, I will say this, where it's been more bone than fish,
Yeah.
and so it's just like, this is not even worth it.
Yeah. Well, I think that is all the time we have for this week. If you guys were interested in this topic and would like to check out any other topic we have, feel free to check out our playlist here. If you would like to see some other content we have our website, bbvf.org. You can check out our Facebook page. We do live streaming on Sundays and Wednesdays. Tony, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Levi.
Until next time, guys.